Hello everyone, today we're going to talk about one of the most significant legal cases in American history, Plessy versus Ferguson. This landmark decision has had far-reaching effects on the country, and its legacy is still felt today. The case originated in Louisiana, where a law had been passed that required segregation on public transportation. Homer Plessy, a man of mixed-race descent who was 7/8 white and 1/8 African American, decided to challenge this law by sitting in a whites-only railway car. He was arrested and charged with violating the segregation law. Plessy's case was taken up by a group of civil rights activists known as the Comité des Citoyens, who saw this as an opportunity to challenge the constitutionality of segregation. The Comité des Citoyens believed that the segregation laws violated the 13th Amendment, which prohibits slavery and involuntary servitude. They also believed that the separate but equal doctrine was a sham, and that segregation would always result in unequal treatment for African Americans. The case was heard by the Supreme Court of the United States in 1896, and it was one of the first major challenges to segregation that the court had faced. The outcome of the case would have a major impact on the future of civil rights in the United States, and it was seen as a critical moment in the fight for racial equality. The case was heard by the Supreme Court of the United States on May 18, 1896. Homer Plessy was represented by a group of prominent civil rights activists, including Albion W. Tourget and Louis Martinet. They argued that segregation was a violation of the 13th Amendment, which prohibits slavery and involuntary servitude. They argued that segregation was inherently unequal, and that it was a form of discrimination that was designed to keep African Americans in a subservient position in society. They also pointed out that segregation would result in unequal treatment for African Americans in all areas of life, including public transportation, schools, and restaurants. On the other hand, the state of Louisiana was represented by its Attorney General, William P. Kellogg. He argued that segregation was necessary for the preservation of public order and morality. He also argued that the separate but equal doctrine was constitutional, and that segregation was not a violation of the 13th Amendment. Kellogg pointed to the long history of segregation in the United States, and argued that it was a tradition that should be respected and upheld by the courts. Let's take a closer look at the arguments from each side in the Plessy versus Ferguson case. Arguments for Homer Plessy. Violation of the 13th Amendment. Plessy's lawyers argued that segregation was a violation of the 13th Amendment, which prohibits slavery and involuntary servitude. They argued that segregation was a form of discrimination that was designed to keep African Americans in a subservient position in society. Inherently unequal. Plessy's lawyers argued that segregation was inherently unequal, and that it would result in unequal treatment for African Americans in all areas of life, including public transportation, schools, and restaurants. They pointed out that segregation would make it more difficult for African Americans to access essential public services, and that it would limit their opportunities for education and employment. Discriminatory intent. Plessy's lawyers also argued that the intent behind segregation laws was discriminatory, and that it was designed to maintain white supremacy and control over African Americans. Arguments for Louisiana. Preservation of public order and morality. The state of Louisiana was represented by its Attorney General, William P. Kellogg, who argued that segregation was necessary for the preservation of public order and morality. He argued that segregation was a reasonable exercise of the state's police power, and that it was necessary for maintaining social order and preventing conflict between the races. Separate but equal doctrine. Kellogg also argued that the separate but equal doctrine was constitutional, and that segregation was not a violation of the 13th Amendment. He argued that segregation would not result in unequal treatment for African Americans as long as the separate facilities were equal in quality. Historical tradition. Kellogg pointed to the long history of segregation in the United States, and argued that it was a tradition that should be respected and upheld by the courts. He argued that segregation was an established practice that had been in place for many years, and that it was not a new or radical idea. The Supreme Court ultimately ruled in favor of Louisiana and the separate but equal doctrine, accepting many of the arguments made by Kellogg. The court's decision was based on the idea that segregation was a reasonable exercise of the state's police power, and that it was necessary for the preservation of public order and morality. The court also found that segregation did not inherently imply a badge of inferiority, and that it was not a violation of the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment. The legacy of the Plessy versus Ferguson case has had a lasting impact on race relations in the United States. One of the key legacies is the ongoing problem of racial inequality, which was perpetuated by the separate but equal doctrine established by the Plessy versus Ferguson decision. The Plessy versus Ferguson decision also contributed to the rise of the Jim Crow laws, which further entrenched segregation and racial discrimination in many parts of the country. This doctrine allowed for segregation and discrimination to continue for several decades, resulting in unequal treatment and opportunities for African Americans in areas such as education, employment, and public transportation. The legacy of this inequality continues to this day, as many African Americans still face disparities in areas such as wealth, health, and criminal justice. The Plessy v. Ferguson decision was eventually overturned by the landmark case of Brown v. Board of Education in 1954, which declared segregation in public schools to be unconstitutional. Another legacy of Plessy v. Ferguson is the role it played in inspiring the civil rights movement. The decision was widely criticized by African American leaders, who saw it as a clear example of the racial discrimination and inequality that existed in the United States. This led to increased activism and mobilization, as African Americans and their allies worked to challenge segregation and discrimination through legal and political means. The legacy of Plessy v. Ferguson has also had a lasting impact on the interpretation of the Constitution and the role of the Supreme Court in shaping American society. The decision is now widely considered to be one of the worst Supreme Court decisions in American history, and it is often cited as an example of how the court can perpetuate racial inequality and injustice. The legacy of Plessy v. Ferguson continues to shape the ongoing debates about race and the law, and it remains an important reminder of the need for continued efforts to promote equality and justice for all people. In conclusion, Plessy v. Ferguson was a landmark case that had a profound impact on American society. It established the separate but equal doctrine, which was used to justify segregation for decades. However, the legacy of Plessy v. Ferguson is one of progress and change, and it serves as a reminder of the importance of fighting for equality and justice for all people, regardless of their race. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up and don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more great content. We'll see you in the next video.